few people in a small town is seemingly all it takes to change the world forever. They said it was bad luck. A quick ride across town should not be enough to make a massive impact on hundreds of lives for decades to come. 7 feet tall, dark and with glowing red eyes, wings that could fly effortlessly at high speeds. Who could blame them for trying to run? The story you just saw is the supposed first sighting of the winged cryptid Mothman. Except it's not. There were like 5 other sightings in the month or so before this one. But we'll get to that in a minute. First, some context. In 1966, the United States was hot off an era of optimism, with one of the most popular presidents in the nation's history being assassinated while attempting to quell political rivalries in Texas just 3 years before. Blaming communism, newly sworn-in President Lyndon B. Johnson used the Gulf of Tonkin incident to prove the bombing and later invasion of Vietnam without needing a formal declaration of war. He knew that never happened, by the way. The supposed incident that forced the US to retaliate was meant to be an attack from North Vietnamese torpedo boats. It just ended up being communications of what was meant to be a salvage mission, and even that didn't happen. Instead, 2 US destroyers were shooting and running around in circles, even calling in air support, who were just as confused. A few hours later, the captain of one of the destroyers just straight up said, "Hey man, yeah, I know we reported being attacked by like a bunch of people, but I think Jerry just saw a flying fish or something, so maybe don't bomb the entire country or tell anyone, please." Lyndon B. Johnson just said, "Did you say attacked?" So yeah, the point is, America was very busy. Far too busy to pay attention to a sleepy town called Point Pleasant. For good reason, not much was really happening, but very soon, that would all change. Most Mothman historians describe Point Pleasant as the first official sighting place of what we now call the Mothman, mainly because of the account of events by the Discoveries and Millets, which is the very first published news article of the creature. However, there's a pretty obvious problem to this logic. What if a sighting isn't taken seriously? What if a person's told they're crazy, they're seeing things, or maybe they don't know who to tell? That brings us to the account of Gerald Therese. His account is the earliest modern sighting of Mothman that I could find, having taken place somewhere in the winter of 1957. Therese was out hunting in Braidwood, Illinois with his brother and his brother-in-law. While searching for rabbits and pheasants, they made their way to a lonely, large tree in an open field, when they suddenly heard the crashing of a man-sized winged creature with dark tan-colored feathers storming overhead across the road. This feels pretty clear-cut, right? 3 people saw it clearly in the mid-morning. There could be no mistake. Well, this is where we come with the first problem of this investigation. Can we believe this is true? Gerald Therese likely wasn't lying, despite what most people may think. He probably didn't make up the story to garner attention or create panic. One reason being, he only reported his sighting over 60 years later, when the Mothman craze, as well as both his brother and brother-in-law, had passed, which means they can't corroborate the story, nor I believe they'd be able to with the amount of time that has passed if they were alive. But even if they could, there wouldn't be much benefit to Therese. No reward money or attention, frankly, as the only related article I could find wasn't very popular despite being written by Tobias Wayland, one of the most famous Mothman authors. Obviously, Therese could have solved this issue by telling people earlier. With 2 people to back him up, maybe someone would believe him. Unlikely. Odds are he would have been laughed at, told not to make things up, or to stop acting like a child, since he was just a teenager at the time of the account in 1937. Fine, there's no way anyone could have known about this sighting if he didn't report it. It's pretty hard to make a brand new story and make people believe it was truly the first sighting 60 years after the fact. So why did anyone believe the Scarberries and Millets? They were around the same age, almost the same number of people, so logically they would have received the same treatment Therese would have believed he would have received. Ridicule, mockery, teasing, etc., etc. Ignoring the obvious variable of reporting the sighting as soon as it happened, there seemingly wasn't much setting them apart, except for a 1 in a million coincidence. Everything lined up perfectly. In the days before the couple's attack, 4 other sightings were reported to the police and to the news. November 1st, 1966, while on base in Point Pleasant, a National Guard saw a large humanoid figure on a tree branch. This was likely only taken seriously because the witness was from a respected profession. November 2nd, Woodrow Derenberger, reported seeing a 30-foot long dark grey flying object blocking the highway as he was commuting, only for a man to step out and telepathically tell him, "Be not afraid, we wish only happiness upon you." Which just sounds like the Mormons had been upping their game. Derenberger's report exploded, especially after being interviewed on live television. Shortly after, on November 12th, Kenneth Duncan was digging a grave for his father-in-law with 4 other men when he saw a man-like figure flying from nearby trees towards them and flying right over their heads. Just 2 days later, on November 14th, Mel Partridge was watching television in his home in Salem when it blew out and made a high-pitched noise, which led to his dog, Bandit, barking, but not at the television. Instead, he was barking at 2 red circular lights in the distance towards Partridge's hay barn. When he directed his flashlight at these lights, they reflected back towards him and Bandit, making the German Shepherd run off into the darkness, never to be seen again. The very next day comes our breakout story from the Millettes and the Scarberries. Because the story matched so many parts of these recent reports, while also falling in the exact same time period of just 2 weeks, people believed it could be true because they just saw so much more than the other people had. So they just had to take it as fact. So many people just realized their small town in West Virginia could be the den of a monster. These reports kick off a 13-month period now known as the Mothman Flap. Cryptozoology is the study and search of animals whose present existence is disputed. In these paranormal studies, a flap refers to a massive increase in the sightings of the paranormal during a short time period and relatively small area. The Mothman Flap officially began on the day of Kenneth Duncan's report on 12 November 1966 and ended on 15 December 1967. A period that would start off by newspapers bombarding hysterical townspeople with even more sightings of what they were calling the bird. Later investigations by journalists suggest that there could have been over 100 sightings, but from what I can tell, not many were actually reported to the police or newspapers. I could only find police reports or articles of about 11, many of which I've already mentioned. That brings us back to our previously mentioned problem when we talked about Gerald Treese. Can these reports be believed? Should we only believe the ones that were reported on, or can we assume all are true? Obviously, all of them being in the same time period and having been reported as they happened or just slightly after makes them far more believable to some, but it's not that simple. Actually, there are quite a few issues with these reports because of the unique historical period. The first obvious issue is false reporting, whether it be sincere misidentification of odd-shaped objects or the intentional deception of people trying to benefit themselves in some way. The issues plague many aspects of cryptozoology. Having got access to some of these reports, everyone has access, it's free online, I just want to sound cool, I started noticing some interesting variations in these sightings. Based on our original report from the 2 couples, who we'll be using as our reference, we know the Mothman is a dirt grey man-like creature with wings, muscular human legs with no immediately visible head and light reflecting red eyes. Pretty quickly you'll notice some of the reports vary a bit. November 20th, 5 days after the couple's report, another couple in Ferry Branch reported to a Charleston police officer they saw a large bird. That was it, just a large bird. I guess it's possible it was Mothman, but if even the police officer was skeptical, I doubt it. Just a bit further southeast, Howard Miller from Dixie reportedly saw a 4-foot bird land on a bus shelter, which isn't incredibly helpful. Of the 50 or so reports I could find from this time period, or flap, many are just like this, so I'm just thinking, why mention them? That's because these reports represent another issue, John Keel. Well, he wasn't really an issue, he was just very good at his job, and too famous. Most of the reports I could find of the Mothman sightings come from his book that brought the cryptid to the attention of the wider media, and frankly we probably wouldn't be as aware of the Mothman if it wasn't for his work. Shortly before the initial Mothman sightings, Keel had been an accomplished author and television writer. He knew his stuff. But in 1966, he was asked by the Playboy magazine to write an article about UFOs, which unfortunately was never published, but the research he did for this article launched his passion into UFOs and investigating the paranormal and led him to Point Pleasant. Having been referred to as a big shot paranormal journalist by many in the small town, Many were eager to meet the celebrity and exchange their unexplainable experiences, at least at first. The book Keel wrote, The Mothman Prophecies, is a pretty thorough account of his time in Point Pleasant during the flat. It starts in an odd spot, the end. At 3 a.m., finding himself in a wet, cold morning in late November of 1967, a stranger wandered where strangers were strange. This man, wearing all black clothes in the darkness, knocked on the door of a farmhouse and asked the tenants to use their phone. The husband and wife were terrified and sent the apparition on his way, later telling their friends it could only be a sinister omen, emphasizing a sense of impending doom. Maybe an ominous event was coming, or had the man been the devil himself? This man had of course been John Keel, who was driving home after a speech at a local UFO club in Atlanta, Georgia. After accidentally running his car into a ditch, he had simply been looking for a phone to call a tow truck with. Moving from house to house, he found most phones were inoperable because of the storm, waking many people on the road as he went. The people on this road weren't used to a tall, dark, bearded man waking them up in the early hours of the morning, which led them to believe it was a paranormal event. This solidified when 3 weeks later, 2 of the people that were wakened by him that night passed away when Point Pleasant Silver Bridge collapsed, forcing the others to believe they had in fact seen the devil in West Virginia. How hard would it be for this information to be accepted as fact? So many witnesses can verify his sighting, and all it would take was a big shot New York paranormal journalist to come by and repeat the stories as fact in a book. With this chapter, Keel makes it clear how easy it is for an event to be misinterpreted by a sincere eyewitness. All it takes is for people around the world to experience a vaguely similar but mundane event for it to turn into its own paranormal phenomena. So why does Keel bother? Based on the first chapter, it's apparent he's an educated, intelligent person, as opposed to the image most have formed when believers of the paranormal are discussed. Because that's what he does best. He's a journalist. He talks to people, finding out what they know to determine if there are connections and similarities, and eventually pieces it all together to expose the truth. A process I'm sure he was incredibly familiar with. A trained serviceman, he was skilled in psychological warfare as a propagandist in the Korean War, a foreign correspondent in major cities in Europe, and a global investigator around the Middle East and Southeast Asia. If anyone would uncover the truth of Mothman, it would be him. However, it wasn't that easy because he wasn't the only person to visit the small town. The book further goes into detail about reported sightings of UFOs that Keel had gathered over the years, but they also include interactions with these people called the Men in Black, a phrase he created. These people were notably odd, inadequate at conversation, and always slightly missing the mark of what is considered social norm, and often described as Oriental, an outdated offensive term for those of Asian descent. They would drive old cars that looked brand new, wear ill-fitting clothes out of fashion, or rather worryingly, hadn't been in fashion yet. Those who presented themselves as members of the Air Force or other military officers often knew no terms related to the occupation and were unaware of the procedure, and would often conduct interviews with tape recorders they didn't know how to use, asking questions that were unintelligent and unclear. But those who were close to John Keel and interviewed by these people seem to have been asked one common question. What if you were ordered to stop reporting on the UFO sightings?